Minsky and Papert's 1969 proof that a simple perceptron couldn't learn basic logic, like an XOR function, stalled the field for over a decade. Without a way to train more complex models, neural network research entered the AI winter. The solution that eventually revived the field was algorithm number 36, backpropagation. If gradient descent is the process of walking downhill to find the lowest possible error, backpropagation is the mechanism that calculates the specific vector of that downhill direction across millions of dimensions simultaneously. To solve nonlinear logic problems, a network requires these hidden layers stacked between the input and the output. But stacking these layers creates a credit assignment problem. When a massive web of neurons makes an incorrect prediction, there is no immediate way to know which specific weight in the middle of that web caused the error, or by how much. Researchers could build deep, layered networks, but the very act of adding those layers made finding the root cause of an error mathematically opaque. The naive approach is to nudge a single weight, run the entire network forward to see if the error decreased, and then repeat that test for every other connection in the system. This finite difference method creates a quadratic time complexity problem, O of W squared. Calculating a modern network this way would take longer than the age of the universe. In 1986, a paper published in Nature by David Rumelhart, Jeffrey Hinton, and Ronald Williams demonstrated a mathematical shortcut that bypassed this computational wall. By proving that the gradient could be computed efficiently, the 1986 paper turned deep learning from a theoretical interest into a computable reality. The algorithm's primary function is to determine exactly how much credit, or blame, each weight deserves for the final output. This begins with the forward pass. Information moves from left to right as inputs are multiplied by weights and combined at each hidden node to generate a prediction. At every node, the weighted sum passes through an activation function, like the sigmoid curve shown here. This squashes the values and introduces the nonlinearity the network needs to learn. This curve must be smooth and continuous. If there are hard, jagged steps in the function, the calculus used to assign blame later will not work. During this pass, the network is blind to its own performance. It simply processes data through a series of filters to make a guess, which inevitably results in an error. The prediction is compared to reality to calculate the total loss. The algorithm then pushes that error backward through the exact same connections. Flowing in reverse, it produces a specific gradient for every connection, an instruction manual on how each weight must change. Once every weight has its own gradient, they all simultaneously take a small mathematical step in the opposite direction of the error. By reversing the flow of information, backpropagation converts one global failure into millions of localized, highly specific weight corrections. This precise isolation of blame is possible because of the chain rule of calculus. It allows us to calculate how a change in a weight buried deep in the network affects a final loss. The total blame is a chain of local derivatives multiplied together along the path. The change in loss relative to the activation times the change of activation relative to the sum times the weight itself. In practice, as seen in this worked example, finding the exact penalty for a weight involves multiplying these local values to find a single result. This calculation allows the network to isolate a single connection's exact contribution to a failure, identifying the required adjustment with perfect precision. The efficiency of this algorithm comes from the fact that it doesn't need to recalculate every state. It simply reuses the activation values that were already computed and cached during the forward pass. Because of this reuse, the backward pass costs the same amount of computing power as the forward pass. This keeps the complexity at O of W, making the training of large models practical. While the underlying calculus is rigorous, implementing backpropagation in Python often requires only a few lines of matrix operations. Backpropagation is the mathematical engine of efficiency, enabling all modern deep learning. Let's open the notebook and see these forward and backward passes in action. This diagram shows the conceptual forward and backward paths used to train a network. In a running program, the computer executes these signals as a sequence of matrix multiplications. This Python code trains a multilayer perceptron to solve nonlinear logic problems like XOR. We process the input data through the first set of weights for hidden activations, then pass those results through the second set to reach a final prediction. These highlighted operations manifest the forward pass, mapping every theoretical arrow to a mathematical step. To initiate the backward flow, we subtract the target from our prediction, creating the error signal that travels back. The forward pass is now complete. We have a prediction and a final error metric, setting the stage for the backward journey of assigning credit and blame. The error signal from the output is now pushed back to the hidden layer. This step determines exactly how much each hidden weight contributed to the final mistake. This step is the calculus chain rule in action. We multiply the local derivatives along the path to find exactly how much a specific weight is to blame for the loss. Note that there is no for loop in this code. In standard Python, a loop would force the computer to process every weight connection one at a time, creating massive computational overhead. Instead, matrix multiplication allows the hardware to calculate the layer's gradients in a single parallel sweep. By calculating weight changes simultaneously, the backward pass costs the same magnitude as the forward pass. We have the backward error signals for every node. How do we use our learning rate, eta, to physically update the weights? We subtract the gradient, scaled by the learning rate, from the current weight values. The backward pass stays efficient because it reuses the hidden activations we already stored in memory during the forward pass. Modern developers rarely write these backward pass matrices by hand. Programming frameworks like TensorFlow use autodef. They record the forward operations and automatically replay the chain rule logic in reverse whenever you update the model. Whether you are training a simple digit classifier or a massive language model, a single fit command relies entirely on these few matrix multiplications firing behind the scenes. Backpropagation's efficiency is what trains the modern world. We know the chain rule makes backpropagation work, carrying the error signal backward through the network layers. But as that math travels backward through a deep network, passing through multiplication after multiplication, the numeric signal physically shrinks. Eventually, it fades into almost nothing. To understand why that mechanical breakdown happens, we first have to see what a healthy training process actually looks like geometrically. This contour map shows gradient descent's geometry. We walk down these concentric lines toward the center point of minimum error. Each red arrow represents one full neural network cycle. Push data forward for a prediction, propagate error backward. One forward, one backward. One step down. Backpropagation is the physical machinery dragging the network toward accuracy. But like any mechanical engine, it has absolute limits when placed under extreme stress. Despite its stress fractures, backpropagation survived the long AI winter and dominates machine learning today. Because it is exact, it is cheap, and it is general. This raw efficiency allowed researchers to scale training from small lab experiments to networks with millions of parameters. But an efficient engine will still stall out if the math degrades. At scale, backpropagation suffers from the vanishing gradient problem. Looking at the failure mode at the bottom, you can see the results. Because the chain rule multiplies derivatives layer by layer, numbers smaller than 1 rapidly disappear. The error signal starts at 0.6, but by the early layers, it drops to 0.005. The early neurons effectively stop learning. To fix this, researchers had to develop specific tools like the ReLU activation function and batch normalization to keep the error signal alive across deep layers. The algorithm also requires a smooth, differentiable loss function, so the calculus remains valid. It only ever guarantees finding a local minimum down the error hill, and it is highly sensitive to the learning rate, the size of those steps taken toward the bottom. If you are working with a small, tabular dataset in a spreadsheet, you're over-engineering. For basic data, a decision tree or random forest will often run faster and predict more accurately. These physical limits don't invalidate the algorithm. Instead, the need to accommodate backpropaganda's requirements dictated the design of every major deep learning architecture built since. Overcoming those limits allowed backpropaganda to scale, and today it is the universal engine. It is the training mechanism behind essentially every modern neural network in existence. Convolutional networks for vision, value networks for reinforcement learning, and transformers driving large language models all use this mathematical engine to learn from data. If you train a small network to recognize handwritten digits, backpropagation doesn't build the hardware or curate the data, but it is the essential bridge that translates those massive resources into actual weight updates. Pushing errors backward to assign blame is the mechanism that makes deep learning possible. But the architecture of a standard dense network hits a ceiling when processing high-resolution images. Wiring every single input to every single hidden node causes the number of connections to explode into the millions, making the math practically impossible to manage. To process visual data, we need an entirely different physical chassis, one that keeps the backpropagation engine, but redesigns how the neurons are wired together. To explore that architecture, and the rest of the 50 algorithms every programmer should know, check out the book linked in the description. Mastering the learning engine was only the first step. The next challenge is designing the specialized structures to feed it.